Gee, I feel like a DJ at a radio station. Like a talk show host, like yada yada yada. Live, coming to you from the studio bedroom of Vinny. Sorry. I've had some ideas about Tesla's special generator I'd like to share, and to start off with, I'd like to do a little catch-up or supplemental addition to the discussions that I had been having with a Philip Nelson a few years ago when we first started talking about his experience with Over Unity as a PA operator during rock concerts. He had keep his eye on the meters and his fingers near the buttons or dials in case any kind of indication might occur that would indicate to him or hint to him that a possible blowout or blow up of one of or more of his speakers distributed throughout the audience might occur. To prevent it, he would have to cut power or something, because if he got to be pretty good at knowing, kind of by rule of thumb or by without thinking, just knowing what to look for in a sense without having to analyze it a whole lot. Although he did try to analyze and theorize what was going on, because he became curious. Here he's got these grounded AC generators, run by gasoline, yet the power running through his system varied, apparently based on the signals coming from the microphones that were up on stage. The microphones were providing signals, and the power was coming from somewhere else other than the generators, because the RPM of the generator never varied, and the generator alone had its own meters on the side of the generator, and those meters never varied. Yet the power going through the speakers varied, sufficient enough that sometimes the speakers would blow up and catch fire, or catch fire and blow up, depending on how you want to look at it, I suppose. Which, when I think about it, I don't know if we discussed it, would indicate arcing, which implies an electrostatic field. So my thought this evening is that is the missing ingredient, the Hutchinson Effect. That there is something going on analogous to the Hutchinson Effect, and the component that's missing in the equation of where is this extra energy coming from has something to do with the Hutchinson Effect, predicated on an electrostatic field happening either underground beneath the audience's very feet, at the very least, but probably in the airspace above ground as well, in particular inside the speakers themselves, focused, here we go now, focusing on the diaphragm of the speaker, acting as a dielectric. And because of the surface area of that diaphragm, there is a good deal of capacitance, yet the diaphragm is not, strictly speaking, a capacitor alone, but it's functioning like an Anderson-style antenna system in the makeup of the PA arrangement. So we have to go back to Eric Dollard, the Crystal Radio Initiative, and how the whole point was to have independent verification by anybody who wants to participate in replicating his initiative, to demonstrate that there is some power coming through the earth from AM radio stations, that if you can stretch out a coaxial cable, I don't know how long, a mile long, buried underground in the horizontal position near just under the surface of the ground, I think something like 18 inches, that you can pick up AM power from the radio station, enough to light up a 100-watt light bulb. That was, I believe, the gist of the Crystal Radio Initiative. And he didn't get as much response as he would have liked. But I think that Philip Nelson's experience is running along parallel lines of functionality, in that I'm beginning to suspect that Tesla's special generator is an adaptation in the modern world of Nathan Stubblefield's Earth battery, inasmuch as Nathan Stubblefield could no longer do what he would like to do because he only managed to do it in the country. He couldn't do it in New York, and that's when his financiers broke down and he became a depressed, broken man, because in the city there was so much AC noise because they run half the power through the earth and the other half through the grid. The earth is part of that grid. Just as the telegraph operators in the 1800s ran half their power through the line and the other half through the earth to complete the circuit. Well, they do that with our power grid, and they don't even tell us. So we're clueless that half the power is running through the ground at all times, at any one point in time, reversing directions 60 times a second, or 120 times a second, whatever. I won't bother trying to be accurate here. I'm just trying to give you an overview. In North America. So Nathan Stubblefield literally used, according to the stories, he had a clean source of energy in as much as there was no dirty electricity. There was no electrosmog. Because he was using the earth alone in areas of the countryside not cluttered by the AC use of the earth. And yet, the story is that he literally ran motors. Were they DC motors, AC motors? But he ran them off of the power from the earth. He ran all manner of loads. If you go to John Bedini's webpage on Nathan Stubblefield, and then you do research, because there is a lot of stuff. There's actually a collection of papers, an archive of newspaper articles and family letters and all kinds of stuff surrounding Nathan Stubblefield at the Murray State University Library. They have an archive. And if you know what to look for, because they have a catalog of every item, you can bring it up or search the archive. I guess they've digitized it. In any case, there's indications that there are stories that he powered all kinds of loads off of his so-called earth batteries, which he never held to be actual batteries. That's what they were called in the patent, but they were more like receivers, more like anything else. Well, I think what Tesla did with his special generator was he realized what William Lyne he put it out there. He said it, not in his book. I don't think it's in his book, Pentagon Aliens or Space Aliens from the Pentagon in his earlier edition. It's in the interview with Paul Scarzo from the 33rd Parallel, in which he says, I don't think the power powering our homes is coming from the power company. It's so far away. I think the power is coming from the earth. He thought it was being supplemented by the water meter. And that there is something coming from the generators, but it's seed power, he called it. Well, in my discussion with Philip Nelson, we came to the conclusion it's a signal that's coming from the microphones on stage. And I can't remember if we stated further, but I'll state it now, that the generator is merely providing his gas-fired generator to run his PA system for these rock concerts, because they have to provide all the power. When they set up stage in some, outdoor arena, they don't get to plug in anywhere, so they have to create their own grid. And this is where he discovered that the microgrid that he created is over unity in many instances. So what I'm thinking is that the generator created a carrier wave, which you could call it a seed power in William Lyne's terms, because it never varies. But it's not the full accountability of where is the energy coming from, because it never varies. As the meters, as Philip Nelson said, the meters on the side of the gas-fired generators, AC generators, never varied their output. Yet the meters on his panel, the PA panel, varied considerably, way beyond what the generator was supplying. Now, we had discussed maybe it's the circuitry, the amplifier circuitry, the various circuitry modifying the signals coming from the stage microphones being processed before they went out to the speakers. That might be involved. But the actual blowout didn't occur in the panel. And it did not occur in the generators, as I recall, because they were grounded, so they couldn't blow up. But the speakers apparently were not grounded, and that's where the excess of energy would occur, the overunity would occur, to the extent that they would blow up. Now, my suggestion is to do what Richard Hackenberger did to avoid another FCC raid, because the FCC raid was the second of the two raids that the EV Gray motor suffered. The first was the DA's office, and just a few years later, with Richard Hackenberger on board, they had a second raid from the FCC because they were creating an electrostatic field and they weren't dealing with it properly. They were just blowing up batteries, and that wasn't effectively soaking up all the energy. There was still an electrostatic field, or else those batteries would not have blown up. An electrostatic field built up beyond what the batteries could sink. They were using batteries as a sink to soak up a sinkhole, to soak up the excess energy that was eventually, Richard figured out, is electrostatic in nature. So they learned to flush compressed air through the interior of the chassis of the EV Gray motor, now to flush out the ions that were building up to prevent arcing. And this proved to be the solution to the possibility of having another FCC raid on their hands. So this is my suggestion to Philip Nelson, is to force air not only on the interior of the speakers, but on the exterior, across both sides of the diaphragm, because that's where I think the charge is initially building up, such that arcing may be occurring inside those speakers among his co-workers who are running their own PA systems, who are not so deft like he has learned to be over the years that he's been hired as a PA operator from time to time. They don't know what they're doing, and so they allow the charge to build up. And I think it's building up on both sides of that diaphragm, and so if air is run across the surface of both sides of the diaphragm, it might help prevent buildup of electrostatic charge, such that a PA operator such as himself would have to quickly cut the power to prevent that speaker from blowing up. That's what I think the solution is, because that's where I think the power is coming from, because I think that diaphragm is acting as an Anderson-style antenna system, according to Eric Dollard's study of the Anderson system. There was another guy he quoted, McFarlane and Anderson? I forget. It was two guys who modified what Marconi had done a completely back-ass bad job trying to do, and failed because he didn't understand what he was doing. Anywho, so that's my suggestion to Philip Nelson. Now, I say this because I got an idea of how to modify the last video I did, which had a diagram of a solid-state version of Tesla's special generator, because I think his special generator, all he did was he realized that AC power is not going to go away anytime soon. We're kind of stuck with it. And he realized what to do to... We don't need Wardenclyffe. Okay? Because AC power is all over the planet. All we need to do is make use of it. That's all. And what is it providing us? It's providing us with a carrier wave. And the load, because that's what the microphones on stage that Philip Nelson and I were discussing, the load are the microphones. Yet all they do is create a signal, a voltage varying signal without any power coming from the microphone. It's just a signal. It's intelligence. It's providing intelligence, a signal, a voltage varying signal. which has nothing to do with current variation, because it's not providing power. And it's not exactly a current load either, but it's a load of a sense, in a sense, that is strictly voltage oriented, and it's modulating the system, while the speakers apparently are providing the power, the current, modulated by the microphone inputting their voltage varying signals coming from the stage, and then all of it being processed and mixed in the PA panel and all the circuitry that goes with that. So it's a it's a five-part system. The earth, the grounded generator, is grounded to the earth. That's part of the system. The generator is another part. The microphones is a third part. The speakers is a fourth part, and the circuitry to connect it all together is the fifth part. And you can include the sixth part, the PA operator managing it all. So I think what Tesla realized is that we don't have a world of Nathan Stubblefield anymore, because he knew about Nathan Stubblefield. They were, they lived in the same era. It would be stupid of Tesla not to be well versed in all his fellow inventors across the planet. What are they doing? Is it related to what I'm doing? What can I gain from studying what they're doing, if there is, anything to learn? Because he was so far ahead of everybody. But I think he probably kept abreast of what Nathan Stubblefield was doing, and he realized that we can't go the route of Nathan Stubblefield anymore, and that's why Nathan Stubblefield failed, because it's a city life, and AC power is cluttering the earth waves, what we would say the airwaves, right, of the crystal radio, of radio broadcasting. Now it's the earth that's being cluttered with noise. So I think what Tesla did was he decided to adapt. And the special generator is his adaptation to today's modern world and the circumstances herein that we find ourselves immersed in. So, taking William Lyne's supposition that the generator is providing seed power, it's not the watt-hour-meter, because William Lyne said in his discussion with me that the watt-hour-meter is a scaled-down version, a watered-down version of Tesla's special generator. And so I'd have to take that into consideration, that what he also said was, don't focus on the watt-hour-meter. It's a waste of time. I mean, you got to grow beyond it to come up with Tesla's special generator. So what I'm thinking is that my latest fantasy of replicating a solid-state version would be a dry stack, a capacitor stack of multi-plates, of alternating copper and aluminum plates, discs, let's say, along the lines of kind of like Nathan Stubblefield's earth battery, or the earth batteries in use by other people who were studying earth batteries at the time. They had alternating plates of iron and, was it copper or zinc, with gravel in between, and they stacked them, they buried them, according to John Bedini, in the vertical position. Well, I'm beginning to think it doesn't have to be buried in the earth, that it merely has to be a dry stack of plates. But instead of gravel, I would suggest maybe waxed paper or butcher paper, because butcher paper was used in the Lockridge device. Am I remembering correctly the correct term, the Lockridge? That was, of course, named in honor of the GI who found it, but it was built by some unknown German, built in his basement in Germany, found by the Lockridge private army guy, who took it home with him to Idaho. But it was running, self-running, a bank of 300 watts of lights bulbs. So a non-inductive load, purely a resistive load, but running, self-running, and powering a bank of 300 watts of light bulbs. So it used a capacitor made of, I think it was a copper sheet sandwiched with a sheet of butcher paper and wrapped up into a spiral-shaped capacitor, in addition to the alternator that came out of, I think it was a Volkswagen, but Lockbridge repeated the experiment using an alternator that came out of a certain brand of automobile that was built in the 50s, I think, or was it the 40s? I think it was the 50s, when he replicated the Lockbridge device and sold those units for a limited duration in Idaho to various campers who took them out to generate electricity for their camping experience. Anyway, so a butcher paper could be the alternate to paraffin-based wax paper. So the wax paper acting as the dielectric sandwiched in between alternating copper and aluminum plates. And I was thinking of pennies for the copper plates and aluminum slugs for the aluminum. And then a very, very, very long column stacking of these plates, wound with insulated iron wire around the stack, buried in the earth only as a matter of convenience, because it has to be dry earth, not moist. Paper dry, really, we're talking dry, like desert dry earth, so as not to be shorted. Just out of convenience and connection to the, out of convenience, because the only connection to the earth is at the two ends of the stack, which are each connected to grounded aerials, one at each end of the stack. So it doesn't have to be buried in the earth. It could be elevated up above ground for all I care, because it doesn't matter. What matters is that it remains dry and that the two ends be connected to two grounded aerials. Okay? And the aerial should have a large surface area of the part above ground. That is kind of derived from one of Tesla's patents, which I think I list. Actually, I do list on the opening page. One of the opening pages, because it got so long I had to divide it up at earthinglife.info. I have a diagram straight out of one of Tesla's patents. The aerial, the one that's the radiant energy, picking up radiant energy from the air. But in this case, it's two grounded aerials, and there might be a wire short between the two aerials to create a loop, a closed loop. And it's not self-starting, so you have to kick-start it while your load is already first connected. And it's kick-started because ultimately you want the capacitor bank to pick up energy from the earth, the AC power that's already being sent through the earth. Except it's not power, is it? According to our interpretation of Philip Nelson's experience and William Lyne's perception of the matter, is simply a signal. Carrier wave and a signal. Well, the signal is coming from the load. Okay? And it's a varying signal. The carrier wave is coming from the power station, but the power ultimately is coming from our environment, the earth itself. So those are the three components that we have to take into consideration when we're trying to replicate Tesla's special generator, because this is what Philip Nelson's experience is. You've got a carrier wave, you've got a signal, a voltage varying signal, and then you've got the power itself. So the purpose of the stack is to create an electrostatic field. And the purpose of the grounded aerials is to pick up the carrier wave, share a little, of the carrier wave coming from the power grid. But that won't vary. Okay? And it won't be a whole lot because there's no resistance in this circular array. Because the load is connected to this circular array in parallel, not in series. so we don't break the circuit at any time. The arrangement of the wire wrapped around the stack of capacitor plates and the wire that goes between the two aerials, shorting them out. But it's elevated above ground. So this is a wire short. So it's like an Anderson antenna in a sense, because you've got the wires above ground. But now you've got the stack plates underneath with the inductive coil wrapped around them underground in this case. It could be laid on top of the ground, just as long as it stays dry. Yeah, that might be a better way to put it. Elevated above ground, put it. I just thought, because I'm living in a dry environment most of the time, although it happens to be raining at the moment, it would just be advantageous if I'm just doing a stack of pennies and slugs that might as well use the dry earth as the supporting mechanism, because it's usually dry here all the time. I mean, the ground is dry, bone dry. There we go, bone dry. The poor orange orchard surrounding the building is like, the trees are like dying. Although they should get a little fluff up from this rain. The leaves go whee, and open up and uncurl. The poor oranges are dehydrating anyway. So I think basically the way I'm envisioning or fantasizing, excuse me while I wipe my nose, is that it won't draw power from the grid, because there's no resistance in the coil-wrapped wire surrounding the capacitor stack, shorted out, running through and between the two grounded aerials. There's no power drain. There's no resistance. So it's not going to cost the grid any power to speak of. I mean, it's like, how much resistance is there in a wire, Just about almost none. So it's not like it's costing anything. And it's not directly connected to the grid anyway. It's directly connected to itself. It's simply in the field, immersed in the field by being grounded to the earth in two spots. Now, as I recall, when you want to, according to Wikipedia, RF grounding, when you ground the two ends of a coaxial cable, you're grounding out electromagnetic interference, was it? While if you ground only one end of a coaxial cable, you're grounding out electrostatic. So if you ground both, you cover both. You cover electrostatic grounding as well as electromagnetic. So that might be why I'm having the use of two grounded aerials, because I want to cover both grounds. I want to cover the electromagnetic field as well as the electrostatic. But it's not directly connected to the grid, because it shorts itself out with itself. So it's not going to cost the grid any energy. Yet, it's making use of the carrier wave, while the load connected to it is actually providing the signal aspect of power. Not the power aspect, but the signal aspect of the load. It's generating the signal aspect of the load, while the earth would be providing the power aspect of the load. That's the point to the fantasy. Is to take advantage of the existence of the fact that we live in an AC polluted environment, so might as well make use of it and suck up to it, because there's no getting around it at the moment. If for some reason everything should collapse, society, and we no longer have AC power, then we can go back to Nathan Stubblefield's methodology, and probably somebody here and there will start to replicate it. But it's impossible now, the way things are. Forget it. It's not even worth trying. But it's good to keep it in mind that that's the alternative when there is no AC power coming from the power company, supposedly, is to go the Nathan Stubblefield route, to substitute, replace what we would have lost should the power grid go down. If we knew what we're doing overnight, which of course is unlikely, because it usually takes years to figure out how to replicate somebody else's work. But in the meantime, I think that's what Tesla's special generator is designed to do. It's not designed to generate power. It's designed to pick up the power from the Earth, making use of the carrier wave that surrounds us coming from the AC power grid, and the signal, the voltage varying signal that comes from the load, whatever it is you're trying to power. That's essentially the way to define Tesla's special generator. Now, that's not to exclude what I've been surmising or guess estimating about the involvement of John Hutchinson's Hutchinson Effect. That's very much a part of it. But it's not the whole story. We have to bring in Nathan Stubblefield's attempt to use Earth energy as the other part of the story. And then we have to bring in Philip Nelson and my discussion with him about his PA system to complete the story of what is Tesla's special generator. So it's a complex of stories interweaved among each other to try to come up with a scenario of how to guess estimate what the whole story is of what's going on here. Because unless we have the big picture, we're not going to be able to design a circuitry. It'll be impossible. I mean, maybe with 100,000 monkeys working for 1,000,000 years, they'll come up with something by accident. But, we want to shorten the time span and lessen the number of monkeys. Just me. Ooh, 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 ooh. And not 100 million years. So we have to be a little deft, a little adroit about this to try to come up with a scheme that makes intelligent sense. So a few heads are better than one. A few monkey heads are better than one monkey head. And I think that's what we've done here. What's possibly we've managed to do. Possibly. I'm hoping. As I keep hoping to make improvements, but this is my latest attempt to improve upon the scenario picture that I'm painting with a very, very broad stroking brush. Very broad. Generically so. Without getting too much into details. I mean, some enough. Just enough to try to hold the story together. Loosely. Very loosely. Loosely, broadly speaking. But that's the gist of it, pretty much. And, hey, maybe it'll help some of us dwelling on the matter to, there's probably my, if you're so inclined, my best suggestion to get a working knowledge is to go and do what Philip Nelson did. Hire yourself out as a PA operator for rock concerts and get hands-on knowledge over the course of a decade or so to understand what he dealt with, to get a working knowledge of what we're trying to replicate here in attempting to replicate Tesla's special generator, because what William Lyne said in that Paul Scarzo interview is a valid statement. That he didn't think all the power coming from the power company is the power that we see lighting our lights and running our loads. It's coming from somewhere else. And our awareness that the grid is grounded, thoroughly grounded in the earth, is going to be half of that picture, or part of that picture. There's no way around it. And the Hutchinson effect probably is involved. So, that's what I got to say. So I said my piece, and now I'm shutting up. For now, anyway. If we go back to William Lyne's description of the electro U-boat adaptation of Tesla's special generator during World War II, there's one additional thought to add to this scenario, and that is that the reciprocating piston reciprocating no more than 1/16 of an inch in those mock-ups, the electro U-boat mock-up of Tesla's special generator, may be merely creating a signal-based carrier wave for the system to work off of. But ultimately the energy is coming from the Earth. But you do need a carrier wave, and so the purpose of the reciprocating piston driven by compressed air is to create that carrier wave, that nice, clean, crisp signal that is a very nice pure signal that's not dirty or varying. It's a very clean, high-pitch, short wavelength signal. Although, he kind of contradicts himself, because Williams says that the wire wrapping in that device made use of a very lengthy wrapping to make use of ELF waves, very low frequency, long wavelengths, having to do with the curvature or the dimensions of the Earth itself. So if there's a combination of two things going on, that's a different story. Unless, of course, the reciprocating piston didn't reciprocate very fast. If it reciprocated very slowly, I don't know. I find that hard to believe. But it might be a combination of factors, that the fact that the reciprocating piston is reciprocating at a very fast pitch, probably above the pitch of hearing, so something above 20,000 cycles per second, maybe several, many thousands of cycles per second. So there is no noise, hopefully. I'm hoping. There may be noise. It may not be that high. But then there may be involved a very long wavelength coil wrapping in the setup. But be that as it may, that's what the reciprocating piston is providing, is a carrier wave component of my scenario. And of course the compressed air is blowing out the ions that could build up inside that to prevent arcing and grounding out any electrostatic field component of the system, which would have shorted out the Hutchinson effect, which is designed to amplify the power gain ultimately and create the over-unity that we desire. So there's multiple things being done, taken care of by that reciprocating piston, but initially the core intention is to create that carrier wave that's needed to run the whole system, to be a part of running the whole system. Okay, so that's my little additional thought here. In other words, what I'm trying to indicate is that it's not always necessary under all circumstances, I'm assuming, to provide the signal, the carrier wave, base wave, in all circumstances, but simply make use of what's available. I'm guessing. Now, in the case of the Nazi U-boats, they had to provide their own carrier wave, and in the case of the PA system that Philip Nelson was in charge of setting up and managing during a rock concert, he had to provide the signal, or the carrier wave, in the form of the gas-fired generator, the grounded AC generator. But maybe, just maybe, under many of our current day circumstances, maybe we don't have to provide that carrier wave. Just make use of the AC grid as our carrier wave, and then we add in the other elements to Tesla's special generator to complete the whole scenario. Possibly. That's what I'm guessing at the moment here. Because I'm trying to wonder, well, how did my friend up in Washington State, his coworker, and this was back in the days when they were not in Washington, they were in the Midwest, create a solid-state version? Is because it wasn't. Now let's think about this. You can create a carrier wave with an oscillating silicon oscillating crystal, quartz crystal. So it'll look like it's solid state, when in reality it's not, because you're actually got something vibrating inside. Just like in our quartz crystal watches, all these devices that require a constant signal, that's your carrier, could be the source of a carrier wave. So I originally, in the earlier editions of on Energetic Forum, in my postulating what is Tesla's special generator, I ended up veering in the direction of a quartz crystal oscillator, but I didn't know what role it played. So now I'm saying it provides the carrier wave, not the power. The power doesn't come from it. The power comes from the load, and in two aspects that we've already covered in Philip Nelson's example, the microphones on the stage providing the varying voltage signal. You have to have a signal to vary the system, to modulate the system. with a voltage-driven signal component to this setup. And then the speakers and the amplifying system and the circuitry connecting it all was helping to draw the power, apparently from the Earth, from space, because of the electrostatic field that it's producing in and among the various participants, the audience themselves, and the stage and whatnot, and the whole system. But you have to have a carrier wave, and so quite possibly if you have to provide your own, it may be possible to substitute the reciprocating piston or the AC power station with a quartz crystal oscillator to have a constant carrier wave being generated. So that's the other alternative. And that might have been in the solid state version that my friend's coworker was making use of. Somehow is the need to have a carrier wave. So it's not all about copper, aluminum, and iron, because there's that carrier wave component that has to be included in the system and not left out. Because it's a fourth ingredient that's very important. But there's other ingredients. The voltage varying signal from the microphones on stage, that's another one. And then the load itself. So we've got a lot of elements, and so it's not all about three metals. There's more to it, obviously, or else somebody would have replicated it by now. So we have to include these missing ingredients and guess estimate what they are. And this is my attempt to do just that. In fact, I'm suspecting that it is an imbalance of charge between the two sides, the inner surface and the outer surface of the diaphragm of the speakers in Philip Nelson's PA setup, that's causing the blow-up and possible arcing leading to the blow-up to occur. Because you've got the interior space, the interior side of the diaphragm, in which the airspace is an enclosed space, and so you can get a very large buildup of charge on the interior side of the diaphragm, while on the exterior you've got the ambient air surrounding the outside of the speaker meeting up with the outside surface of the diaphragm, and this can cause ions to readily move off the outside surface of the diaphragm to carry away charge much more readily than on the inside. So I think there's a buildup of charge on the inside so different from the outside that there becomes an imbalance between the two sides, and that imbalance, although it is the source of the power, ultimately can be overdone and burn up the system, because it's not set up to handle that kind of surge of power without blowing up the speaker entirely. So there's a question of managing your wild stallion of a horsey to disallow it from getting out of hand, because that's what some of these free energy devices do. You can literally time how long it takes for the meltdown to occur, and then the device doesn't work anymore because it just melted itself. It's no longer functional. It's no longer has any structure. It's just melted. So I can't remember, I read it somewhere. One of these devices was a tiny little table model, and it just fried itself because the COP was like in the millions, and it just accelerated out to infinity and just fried itself. You could time it with your watch, how long it'll last, So that might be what's happening, is too much of a difference of charge on either side of the diaphragm being allowed to build up, because it can dissipate on the outside, but it can't dissipate on the inside. And although you might think, oh, more power, but if you go too far, then you might get an arcing situation on the inside, leading to a fire and an explosion of the system. The explosion may happen simply because it can't arc, and the difference keeps building up between the two sides of the diaphragm. So it may not be arcing. It may be that it simply builds up a potential difference between the two sides of the diaphragm, the interior and the exterior, to such a degree that it literally does blow up. What did Tesla do? He ran up the voltage on very thin wire to the point of exploding the wire into vapor. He wanted to see, the limits of what he could do with various materials. He did that with capacitors. He would break capacitors to see how far he could take their capacitance before they broke. The shearing force of the voltage buildup. So it's interesting, but that seems to be what's happening. So it may not be arcing, but blowing air through the interior space might help, because it would change the ionic charge riding along the face of the interior face of the diaphragm and change its charge, bleed it out, ground it out to an air mass that's flowing through the interior space. So it's really on the interior side of the diaphragm where it's needed the most, much more so than the exterior. Although it might be needed on the exterior, but it's the interior, I suspect, that where the air circulation has to be inserted into the system, because who puts air compressors on the interior of a PA speaker? I don't know. I've never heard of it before. Maybe it happens, but it's probably why they blow up, because nobody thought of doing it. Nobody took electrostatic measurements to see during the course of the life, the operation of a speaker, to see, what's going on here that might cause it to approach the possibility of blowing up. Do an analysis, a field analysis, a field study. It sounds like nobody's done this. They just, manage it, It's, good grief. So somebody's not thinking. The designers who design these PA systems, the speakers for these PA systems, don't have the knowledge that Mark McKay provides us in his analysis of the EV Gray motor, because that solves the riddle of why they're blowing up and what to do to prevent it. Okay.